Alright, let's follow along with our next section for today, and this is on population ecology. If you'd want more information or want to look up some other pictures, some of the pictures and graphics that I use, you can find those in chapter 52 of your textbook. Alright, so one of the ways that we can organize how life occurs here on our planet is to look at how species occur. So we're going to look and learn about population. So the definition of population that I use, you're going to see some repetitiveness to this. It's a group of individuals of a same species in the same area at the same time. So this brings about some interesting things, because if you're the same species in the same place at the same time, you're going to rely on the same resources. You're probably going to interact somehow, so have some sort of behaviors involved with your species, and you're probably going to breed with one another. So a population ecologist would look at the factors that it would affect this particular population. So why is this something that's important to study? Well, a lot of times we want to be able to understand what influences the size of a population. And we may do this maybe to either increase a population size, let's say for an endangered species. We might be trying to decrease the population size if it's a pest, or for example, talking about some of those invasive species that you've been reading about. Or if we just want to maintain that population size. When we look at salmon or tilapia, fish that we eat, we want to be able that we can maintain that species and at the same time yield a product from them that can be used. So here are a couple things that can affect population size. One thing can be the abiotic factors, and I kind of refer to them as these are kind of like the laws. You know, if you don't have sunlight, if you don't have the right temperature, the law is going to rule and you're not going to be there. If you don't have correct precipitation or water, the law is going to rule and you're not going to be there. And if you don't have proper soil or nutrients, depends on plants versus animal, and even some bacteria can live without certain nutrients. But at some point, an abiotic factor is going to control population size. And I think it's interesting to look at even how human populations are dispersed in the biomes. And if you look at the picture I have over here, you know, what makes North America so heavily populated? What makes China and some of the regions over here so heavily populated versus something like right in here in Africa that doesn't have that same high population, or Antarctica that doesn't have that same population? We're going to point back to one of those abiotic factors. Now there are living factors too, and those are called biotic factors. Could be other organisms, maybe something that's used for food, something that provides competition, predator, parasites, disease. We can put all of those in there. So obviously if you look at the population of the zebra, they are probably going to be a little dependent upon this whole population of this nice little lion here. And it looks like, I don't know, that doesn't look like a lion over there. That kind of looks like a hyena, but maybe it's a lion, I don't know. And we got some vultures coming in here too. Alright, there's also some intrinsic factors involved, and we'll talk, I just want to introduce this idea that, you know, adaptations and evolution play a huge role in everything that we deal with in science. And we'll talk a little more about this when we get to that unit. So some things when we start describing populations, some terms that you may see an ecologist use is they may talk about the range of a population. Take a look at this bird that we see immigrating from Africa, and we're watching as the years pass. This bird is going to all these new different areas, and there's a very famous, it's called a Christmas Day bird count that people actually participate in. For some people it's a tradition, and that's what it tends to do. It tracks ranges of different species of birds. We're also going to talk to you, and I'm going to show you some pictures of pattern spacing, or the density of a population, and then we'll finish up a little bit with the size of the population. Alright, so population range, dependent upon, I showed you that picture of that bird's range that changed over times. It might be due to some abiotic factors or biotic factors, and also the habitat. What adaptations does that animal have that will allow it to survive in different locations? If you notice, if I go back a slide, this bird who is immigrating in doesn't go over here on this side of the South American coast, and we really don't see it as far up north here. And now I know 1970 is a little bit later as far as the figure goes, but there must be some limitation habitat-wise as to why that bird is not going to those additional places. Population spacing, I think this is one of the most interesting ways of studying a population. When we looked at the clumped part here, the best picture that I could find to help you represent this are wolves. These are packs, or these are herds that you tend to see clumps of individuals or ranges. They might have different ranges. They may interact a little bit, but they still go back to that home pack. I often kind of think that maybe humans might fall in this realm because we talk about our families and our extended families, and we even talk about how we live in cities where we have clumps of high populations. Random populations, oh, we'll look at this again in the springtime when all the dandelions are blooming in the front lawn here at the high school. But there really is no pattern. You could go and take a couple transects, some sections of this land, and you would find no pattern to how the dandelions are growing. And the last one to look at here is uniform population. I've got a really good picture showing this too of penguins and nesting sites. So let me show you a couple of these. The clumped, this is definitely the most common. You see it in flocks or schools or herds, and it does occur in plants. Oftentimes you see clumps of plants growing together. And then here's the uniform one I was talking about. This is just very interesting because there's some behavior associated with this too, with the uniform pattern, and a lot of it is territorial types of behavior. Now you notice we skipped chapter 51. I want to give you a little bit better background on ecology before we jump straight into animals and their behaviors, and we'll do a couple laps with that later on in the unit. Alright, so the other way that we can characterize population is by their size, and you might look at changes, birth rates, death rates. You also might look at populations that are moving in, immigration, versus populations leaving a region, immigration. So I kind of have a figure here with these birds with their population sizes. Births and immigration generally are like a plus sign to the population, an increase. And immigration and deaths, those would be your minus piece to that. And there's a couple ways that we can show some of our changes in our population size. One of these is this is often used for human populations, these different population graphs. You can look at Kenya, and we categorize Kenya as a country under rapid growth because if you look at where the majority of the population exists, they're very young. And it's thought that that population who is very young can then still reproduce and add to a very large growing population. United States, however, we're at kind of a slow growth type realm. We see almost as many births that we have as deaths, almost as many, not too many. But if you look over at Italy, that population is just stagnant. We don't really see a growth at all, and even if you look at it in some years, you actually see a decrease too. So there's some ways of characterizing this. One thing that I think is interesting is, for the most part, your male and female population is 50-50. And if you think back to Punnett squares and how you produce a male or a female baby, that should make sense to you. So again, looking right here at this red bar, these are people who are of reproductive age, typically. It might extend a little bit more into the 40s, but we really look at that bar to help us determine how fast this green area down here is going to grow, if we're going to see an expansion in that area. You also talk about some of the customs and some of the practices in these countries where you may have large families versus smaller families. Alright, the other way, if we start combining multiple types of data together, we can get something that's called survivorship curves for populations. We're going to talk a little bit more about these in class. We'll actually have a chance to graph some of these too, because that is a major portion of the new AP test, is being able to interpret these graphs. So if I look at the green line here, this is of a typical human. We basically see that after you reach post-reproductive years, which, honestly, we're kind of marking that here at 75. Typically, though, for at least the female aspect, occurs, probably right here in the late 40s, early 50s when you go through menopause. But after that, basically what happens is you don't reproduce anymore, so we show a higher death rate out here in these later years. So that's one way of characterizing this. The other one, let's look at the hydra for an example here. This is kind of belongs to the sea sponge category of animals. You're pretty much got a 50-50 chance of living or dying if you're a hydra. And we just kind of see a constant mortality rate. It doesn't matter if you're young or if you're very old, you've got a 50-50 chance of dying. So we see a little bit more of a straighter curve. The other one to look at here is the oyster. When oysters spawn and produce lots of babies, the likelihood of those babies being able to reach reproductive age is very high. So is very low. I'm sorry. So the mortality rate of the young oysters is very high. Basically, they're eaten by fish, so they are good fish food before they reach this hard shell stage. But however, if you can make it into 25 years or so, that oyster is set to live for a very, very long time, and they stay reproductive for a very, very long time. So we got just a different look to our graph here, and we'll talk about trends and ways that you can characterize how these lines and the slopes of the lines work. So just a couple things when we're talking about the survival versus reproduction. There are some trade-offs and there are some costs associated with those for organisms. If you increase how many times you have to reproduce, that ultimately may decrease your survival. For instance, if you looked at the blue-footed boobies in the Galapagos Island from Honors Bio. When they followed those birds, the mothers who had to raise 2 chicks, in that second year after they had to do that, they saw an increase in mortality rate. Those moms were just completely stressed out and put to their limits of raising 2 chicks. So the moms would allow the stronger baby to fight it out, and the weaker baby ultimately died in the hot sun. They called it siblicide, was something that they did. You have to think about what age you can become reproductively active, the investment, the toll that it takes on that organism per offspring, and then the number of reproductive cycles you have per lifetime. Natural selection will always favor a life history that maximizes lifetime reproductive success. So I think that's interesting to look at too. Alright, last slide here that I'm going to give for you deals with reproductive strategies. I just want to introduce these 2 terms to you, and then we are going to be able to apply these in class to a graph. So as far as, we talked about natural selection favoring a history that maximizes lifetime reproductiveness. There's kind of 2 ways of doing that. We've got the K-selected and the R-selected. So K-selected, I like to think of kangaroos or think of humans for this one. We reach our reproductive maturity very late in our lifetimes compared to others. We only produce a few offspring at a time, and we have an investment in raising that offspring. We will keep that baby with us legally for humans for 18 years. We will teach. There's a lot of learning process that go into raising offspring for a K-selected individual. If you are selected, however, I like to think of rats under this one, mice, insects. They're very good to look at here. They reach reproductive maturity very early. Rabbits can start reproducing at about 6 weeks of age. They have many, many offspring at one time, and they just let these offspring to the wild, basically. There's very little parental care. And I often think that kids have a misconception that these two reproductive strategies deal only with animals, but plants are in this too. Coconut actually falls under a case-selected one. The amount of time it takes for a coconut to fully develop on a tree is about 9 months, which sounds very similar to how long it takes for our babies to develop inside of us, inside of females. Our selected individuals, most plants have a turnaround time of seeds from a couple days to a couple weeks. So a little different, just kind of like with our insects too. Alright, so that's your intro to population. I know it kind of seems a little bit all over the place, but we will definitely bring this all together with some population graphs in class. Alright, see you then.